37,000 feet above the ground, with nowhere to run and 200 strangers watching, a millionaire's baby had been screaming for 45 minutes straight. The woman in the Chanel suit was shaking, her perfectly manicured hands trembling as she rocked the infant against her chest, whispering desperate apologies to anyone who would listen. But it was the quiet man in row 23 who caught my attention. Not because he was complaining like everyone else, but because he wasn't. He sat perfectly still, watching, his 4-year-old daughter tugging at his worn sleeve and pointing toward the chaos in first class. Then she whispered something to him that made his entire body go rigid. Without a word, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. What he did next would leave 200 passengers speechless and change 2 families forever. But first, you need to understand that some heroes don't wear capes. They wear second-hand clothes and carry the weight of loss in their gentle eyes. Daniel Carter adjusted his daughter's safety belt one more time, though it was already perfectly secure. It was a habit he'd developed over the past 2 years. Checking, double-checking, making sure everything was exactly as it should be. Because when you've lost the most important person in your world in a split second, you don't take chances with what remains. "Daddy, why are you nervous?" Lily asked, her small fingers tracing the faded Mickey Mouse pattern on her backpack. At 4 years old, she had an uncanny ability to read the emotions her father tried so hard to hide. "I'm not nervous, sweetheart," Daniel lied gently, though his grip on the armrest betrayed him. This was their first flight since the accident, their first trip to visit his late wife's family in Los Angeles. Sarah's parents had been patient, understanding why he needed time before facing them again, before walking into a house still filled with their daughter's laughter echoing in every room. The Boeing 767 was packed to capacity, typical for a Friday afternoon flight from New York to Los Angeles. Daniel had splurged on the tickets, not for comfort, but because Lily had asked to sit by the window. He would have given her the moon if she'd asked for it, and a window seat seemed infinitely more achievable. As the plane taxied down the runway, Daniel's mind wandered to the bag tucked beneath the seat in front of him. Inside were Sarah's letters to her parents, ones she'd written but never sent, ones he'd found months after the funeral tucked away in her desk drawer. Her handwriting, looping and optimistic even in her final days, filled pages with stories about Lily's first steps, her first words, including the signs she'd learned to communicate with her deaf mother. The engines roared to life, and Lily pressed her face against the small oval window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the ground fall away beneath them. "Look, Daddy, we're flying like birds." Daniel managed a smile, the first genuine one he'd felt all morning. Sarah used to say the same thing every time they flew together. She'd been deaf since birth, but she experienced the world with such vivid intensity that she made everyone around her see things differently. She'd taught him that communication went far beyond words, that love could be expressed through a glance, a gesture, the gentle pressure of fingers intertwined. "Yes, baby girl, just like birds," he whispered, though his voice was lost in the engine noise. The flight settled into its rhythm, the initial excitement giving way to the mundane reality of being trapped in a metal tube for 5 hours. Daniel pulled out a book for Lily, one with bright pictures and simple words that Sarah had picked out months before her death. As his daughter traced the illustrations with her finger, Daniel allowed himself to relax for the first time in weeks. That's when the crying started. It began as a whimper from the first-class cabin, barely audible over the ambient noise of the aircraft. But within minutes, it escalated into the kind of desperate wailing that seemed to penetrate every corner of the plane. Daniel looked up from Lily's book to see flight attendants hurrying toward the front of the aircraft, their professionally trained smiles already showing signs of strain. "Someone's baby is sad," Lily observed matter-of-factly, her head tilted in the direction of the commotion. Daniel nodded, returning his attention to the book, but the crying continued to intensify. It wasn't the typical fussing of an overtired infant or the brief protests of a child adjusting to altitude changes. This was something different, raw, desperate, inconsolable. Passengers began shifting in their seats, craning their necks to peer toward first class. The murmuring started softly, the kind of sympathetic clucking that accompanies any disruption involving children. But as the minutes ticked by and the crying showed no signs of abating, the murmurs took on a different tone. "How long is this going to go on?" someone behind Daniel muttered. "Where's the mother? Can't she do something?" "This is ridiculous. We paid good money for these tickets." Daniel watched as a flight attendant emerged from the first-class cabin, her face flushed with the kind of helpless frustration that comes from exhausting every trick in the book. She approached another crew member in the galley, and though Daniel couldn't hear their conversation, their body language spoke volumes. Shoulders hunched, hands gesturing helplessly, the occasional glance toward the source of the commotion. "Daddy," Lily said, tugging on his sleeve. "The baby isn't just crying." Daniel looked down at his daughter, whose expression had grown serious in the way that only children can manage, completely honest and utterly perceptive. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Lily stood on her seat to get a better view of the first-class cabin, ignoring Daniel's gentle attempts to get her to sit back down. "The baby is trying to say something, but nobody understands." Before Daniel could respond, a woman's voice cut through the crying. Desperate, pleading, on the verge of tears herself. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. He's never like this. I don't know what's wrong." The voice belonged to someone clearly trying to maintain composure in the face of complete chaos, but the cracks were beginning to show. Daniel had heard that tone before, in his own voice during those first terrible weeks after Sarah's death, when Lily would wake up screaming for her mother, and nothing he did seemed to help. "She's scared too," Lily whispered, and Daniel realized his daughter wasn't talking about the baby anymore. The crying reached a crescendo that seemed impossible for such a small human to produce. It was the kind of sound that bypassed rational thought and went straight to some primal part of the brain that demanded action. Passengers were no longer trying to hide their irritation. "This is unacceptable," a man in a business suit announced loudly enough for half the plane to hear. "If she can't control her child, she shouldn't be flying." "Maybe we should request a different flight," another passenger suggested to her companion, as if such a thing were possible at 37,000 feet. Daniel felt his jaw clench. He'd been on the receiving end of those judgmental stares, had weathered the disapproving looks when Lily had her own meltdowns in grocery stores or restaurants during those first months, when everything reminded her of her mother's absence. People were quick to assume, quicker to judge, and rarely paused to consider that sometimes a parent's best efforts simply weren't enough. "I need to help," Lily announced suddenly, starting to unbuckle her seatbelt. "Whoa, hold on there, little bird," Daniel said, using Sarah's pet name for their daughter. "You can't just walk around the plane." "But Daddy, I know what's wrong." Daniel studied his daughter's face, recognizing the determined set of her jaw that she'd inherited directly from her mother. Sarah had worn that same expression whenever she'd encountered a problem that everyone else had given up on solving. "What do you think is wrong?" Lily pointed toward the first-class cabin. "The baby can't hear the mom's voice, so he doesn't know she's there. He's scared because he can only feel her shaking." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He turned to look toward the front of the plane, his engineer's mind suddenly processing details he'd unconsciously noted but hadn't connected. The way the crying seemed immune to verbal soothing. The desperation in the mother's voice as she tried technique after technique that would work on any hearing child. The particular quality of the infant's wails, not angry or demanding, but genuinely distressed. "Lily," Daniel said slowly, "what makes you think the baby can't hear?" His daughter's expression grew even more serious. "He cries like I did when I had the ear infections. Remember? When everything sounded far away and scary? But this is different. He's not just sick hearing, Daddy. He's mommy hearing." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Mommy hearing was Lily's term for being deaf, named after the mother who had shown her that communication came in many forms. Sarah had been profoundly deaf since birth, and while she'd learned to speak, she'd always been more comfortable with sign language. Lily had grown up bilingual in ways most people never considered, fluent in both spoken English and American Sign Language. As if summoned by his thoughts, another voice drifted back from first class, a flight attendant trying to help. "Madam, have you tried feeding him? Sometimes babies cry when they're hungry." "I've tried everything," came the exhausted reply. "Feeding, changing, walking, singing. Nothing works. He's never been like this before." Daniel's heart began to race, not with anxiety but with recognition. He remembered Sarah telling him about her own infancy, how her parents had struggled for months before realizing their daughter couldn't hear their voices, how the world must have seemed terrifying to a baby who could feel vibrations and sense emotions but couldn't understand the comforting sounds of love and reassurance that hearing children took for granted. "Daddy," Lily whispered urgently, "you have to help them. You know how to talk to babies who can't hear." Daniel glanced around the cabin, acutely aware of his surroundings in a way he hadn't been moments before. He was dressed in his typical travel outfit, a faded flannel shirt Sarah had bought him years ago, well-worn jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. His hair needed cutting, and he hadn't shaved that morning. He looked like exactly what he was, a working-class, single-father flying coach with his preschooler. The woman in first class, from what he could glimpse through the gap between seats, appeared to be his exact opposite. Even in distress, her clothes screamed money, the kind of effortless elegance that came from never having to check price tags. Her hair was perfectly styled despite the chaos, and when she turned slightly, he caught sight of jewelry that probably cost more than his annual rent. "I can't just walk up there, sweetheart," Daniel said softly. "She doesn't know me. She might think—" "Think what?" Lily challenged with the blunt honesty of childhood. Daniel struggled to articulate the social dynamics that seemed so obvious to him, but were invisible to his 4-year-old daughter. How do you explain to a child that the world has invisible barriers, that sometimes help isn't welcome simply because of who's offering it? That a scruffy single dad from Coach approaching a wealthy woman in first class might be seen as overstepping, presumptuous, or worse? The crying intensified again, if such a thing were possible, and the mother's voice cracked completely. "Please, James, please, Mommy's here, Mommy's right here." James. The baby had a name now, which somehow made everything worse. He wasn't just a crying infant disrupting a flight. He was James, a scared little boy who couldn't understand why his mother's presence wasn't reaching him. Daniel closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him, forcing himself to really listen instead of trying to block it out like everyone else. Sarah had taught him to do this, to hear the communication hidden within sounds that seemed like noise to others. She'd been endlessly patient during his early attempts to understand her world, correcting his clumsy finger spelling and encouraging his fumbling first attempts at sign language. When he opened his eyes, Lily was staring at him with an expression far too wise for her age. "Mommy would help," she said simply. She was right, of course. Sarah would never have hesitated, would never have let social conventions or class differences stop her from reaching out to someone in need. She'd lived her entire life in a world that didn't automatically accommodate her, and she'd responded by becoming fiercely protective of anyone who seemed lost or misunderstood. "Ma'am, I need you to try to keep him quieter," a flight attendant was saying, her professional patience clearly wearing thin. "The other passengers are getting upset." "I don't know how." The response was barely coherent through tears. "I don't know what's wrong with him." Daniel felt something shift inside his chest, a familiar sensation he hadn't experienced in 2 years. It was the feeling Sarah used to describe when she saw someone struggling with a problem she knew she could solve. Not a desire to show off or prove anything, but a simple recognition that help was needed and help was available. "Lily," he said quietly, "stay right here. Don't move from this seat." "Where are you going?" Daniel was already standing, his decision made in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "I'm going to talk to James." He moved down the aisle slowly, conscious of every eye turning toward him as he passed. The business suit man from earlier looked up with obvious irritation, clearly expecting Daniel to complain about the noise like everyone else. Instead, Daniel offered a small nod and continued forward. The first-class cabin felt like entering a different world. The seats were wider, the passengers fewer, and the atmosphere thick with judgment and barely contained frustration. Daniel could feel their collective gaze as he approached the source of the commotion, their surprise evident that someone from Coach would dare to venture into their domain. And there she was. The woman holding James was younger than Daniel had expected, maybe late 20s, with the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that transcended social status or bank account balances. Her makeup was smeared, her expensive blouse wrinkled from hours of trying to comfort an inconsolable child. The baby in her arms was red-faced and shaking from the force of his own cries, his tiny fists clenched in frustrated helplessness. She looked up as Daniel approached, her eyes wide with the kind of desperation that comes from having tried everything and found it wanting. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel was acutely aware of how he must look to her. A stranger from Coach, approaching uninvited during her most vulnerable moment. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice barely audible over James's crying. "I think I might be able to help." The woman, Victoria, he would learn later, stared at him with a mixture of hope and suspicion. She'd been offered help from flight attendants, suggestions from other passengers, and judgment from everyone else. But something in Daniel's tone, or perhaps in his eyes, made her pause. "I don't think anyone can help," she whispered, her voice hoarse from her own near tears. "He's never been like this. He's usually such a good baby." Daniel took a small step closer, his hands visible and non-threatening. "What's his name?" "James," she said automatically, then seemed to realize she was talking to a complete stranger. "Why?" "May I?" Daniel gestured gently toward the baby, then did something that made Victoria's breath catch in her throat. He raised his hands and began to sign, his fingers moving in the graceful, precise patterns of American Sign Language. His movements were fluid, practiced, the kind of fluency that could only come from years of daily use. "Hello, James," he signed, though he also spoke the words aloud for Victoria's benefit. "You're scared, aren't you? You can't hear your mama, but she's right here. She loves you so much." The effect was immediate and startling. James's crying didn't stop instantly, but it changed, became less desperate, more questioning. His eyes, which had been squeezed shut in distress, fluttered open and fixed on Daniel's moving hands. Victoria gasped. "How did you—" "My wife was deaf," Daniel said simply, never taking his eyes off James as he continued to sign. "This little guy has hearing difficulties, doesn't he? Maybe not completely deaf, but enough that regular sound isn't reaching him the way it should." "The doctors said—" Victoria started, then stopped, her face cycling through a dozen emotions at once. "They said he might have some hearing loss, but they weren't sure. He's only 8 months old. How could you tell?" Daniel continued signing to James, who was now watching his hands with intense concentration, his cries reduced to occasional whimpers. The way he cries, the way he doesn't respond to verbal comfort, and— Daniel paused, offering Victoria a gentle smile. "My daughter noticed it before I did. Kids who grow up around deaf family members get really good at spotting communication barriers." "Your daughter?" "She's 4, sitting back in Coach. She told me James was trying to say something, but nobody understood. Daniel's hands never stopped moving as he spoke, a running commentary of love and reassurance directed at the baby. She said he was scared because he could only feel you shaking, not hear your voice. Victoria looked down at her own trembling hands, then back at Daniel with something approaching awe. You learned sign language for your wife? I learned it because I loved her, Daniel corrected gently. And because love isn't just words. Sometimes it's this. He demonstrated a simple sign, placing his hand over his heart and then extending it toward James. Love, safe. Mama's here. James reached out a tiny hand toward Daniel's fingers, no longer crying, but making the soft cooing sounds of a curious infant. Victoria watched in amazement as her son, who had been inconsolable for nearly an hour, began to calm in the presence of someone who could speak his language. "Can you teach me?" she whispered, and Daniel heard something in her voice that went beyond mere gratitude. It was the sound of a mother realizing she'd been trying to reach her child through a door that had been locked all along, and someone had just handed her the key. "Of course," Daniel said, and meant it completely. What happened next would be talked about on social media for weeks afterward, though the videos people posted never quite captured the full emotional weight of the moment. A man in second-hand clothes teaching a millionaire how to tell her baby she loved him. A first-class cabin transformed from a scene of frustration into an impromptu classroom. A baby's cries replaced by the gentle sound of hands speaking the oldest language of all, love made visible. But that was just the beginning. As Daniel began to show Victoria the basic signs for mama, love, and safe, James settled completely into his mother's arms, his eyes bright with the kind of contentment that comes from finally being understood. The transformation was so complete, so immediate, that the entire first-class cabin fell silent. "I can't believe this," Victoria murmured, practicing the sign for mama, while James watched her hands with fascination. "All this time, I thought I was doing something wrong. I thought I was failing him." "You weren't failing," Daniel assured her, demonstrating how to sign good boy to James, who gurgled with what sounded distinctly like laughter. "You just needed the right tools. Most parents do in situations like this. But how did you know? I mean, so quickly?" Daniel's expression grew soft, tinged with the kind of sadness that never fully disappears, but learns to coexist with joy. "My wife used to tell me that deaf babies cry differently. They're not just fussy or demanding, they're trying to communicate the only way they know how. James was telling you he couldn't find you, even though you were right there." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but they were different tears now. Relief mixed with gratitude and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "I feel so stupid. All those times people stared at us in restaurants, in stores. I thought he was just difficult." "He's not difficult," Daniel said firmly, signing smart boy to James, who clapped his hands in delight. "He's just speaking a different language. Once you learn it, you'll wonder how you ever communicated any other way." The flight attendant who had been struggling to help earlier appeared at Daniel's elbow, her expression a mixture of professional relief and personal amazement. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you. We were running out of options." "No thanks necessary," Daniel replied, though he accepted her grateful smile. "Just happy to help." But as he prepared to return to his seat, Victoria reached out and gently touched his arm. "Wait. Please. I have so many questions. Would you mind staying for a few more minutes, just until I'm sure I can keep him calm?" Daniel glanced back toward Coach, where he could see Lily's curly head poking over the seat back, watching the proceedings with intense interest. She caught his eye and gave him a thumbs up, a gesture Sarah had taught her that meant, "Good job, keep going." "A few more minutes," he agreed. Those few minutes stretched into the remainder of the flight, with Daniel patiently teaching Victoria the basic signs that would help her communicate with James. He showed her how to sign hungry, tired, play, and I love you. He explained how deaf and hard of hearing children often develop differently, how they might reach certain milestones later but achieve others earlier. He talked about the importance of early intervention, about finding specialists who understood hearing loss in infants, about the vibrant deaf community that Victoria and James could become part of. Most importantly, he helped her understand that James's hearing loss wasn't a tragedy to be mourned, but a difference to be embraced. "My wife always said that being deaf didn't make her less than anyone else," Daniel explained, as he showed Victoria how to sign "beautiful baby" to James. "It just made her different, and different can be wonderful if you have the right perspective." Victoria practiced the signs over and over, her movements becoming more confident with each repetition. James responded to each gesture with growing enthusiasm, clearly thrilled to finally have a way to communicate with his mother that worked for both of them. Other passengers in first class began to watch with undisguised curiosity, their earlier irritation replaced by something approaching wonder. A few asked questions, which Daniel answered patiently, explaining about sign language and deaf culture with the enthusiasm of someone who had found his community and wanted others to understand its value. By the time the captain announced their descent into Los Angeles, James was sound asleep in his mother's arms, peaceful for the first time since takeoff. Victoria looked down at her son with an expression Daniel recognized. The same look Sarah used to get when she watched Lily signing in her sleep, little hands moving through dreams in the language of love. "I don't know how to thank you," Victoria said, as the plane began its final approach. "You've given me my son back." "You never lost him," Daniel replied gently. "You just needed to learn how to find him." As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Victoria fumbled in her expensive handbag and pulled out a business card. "I want to stay in touch, if that's okay. I want to learn more. James deserves to have a mother who can really communicate with him." Daniel looked at the card. Victoria Ashford, CEO, Ashford Luxury Brands, and felt a moment of surprise. He'd known she was wealthy from her clothes and her seat, but he hadn't realized she was wealthy. The kind of wealthy that came with power and influence and the ability to change things on a large scale. "Of course," he said, pulling out his own much simpler card from his wallet. "And Victoria, there are support groups for parents of deaf and hard of hearing children, communities where you can learn, and James can be around other kids like him. You don't have to do this alone." Victoria clutched both cards like lifelines. I know this is a lot to ask, but would you consider helping me find those resources? I want to do this right. I want to be the mother James deserves." Before Daniel could answer, a small voice piped up from behind him. "Daddy, is the baby okay now?" Lily had appeared at his elbow, having somehow managed to make her way from coach to first class in the post-landing bustle. She looked up at Victoria with the kind of open curiosity that only children possess, then waved at James, who was just beginning to wake up. "The baby is much better now, thanks to your daddy," Victoria said, her voice soft with genuine warmth. "What's your name?" "I'm Lily, and this is my daddy Daniel. And we know how to talk with our hands because my mummy was deaf, but she died in a car accident, but she taught us how to say, 'I love you,' like this." Lily demonstrated the sign with the matter-of-fact delivery that children use for even the most profound statements. Victoria's eyes widened, and she looked at Daniel with new understanding. "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize." "It's okay," Daniel said, resting his hand on Lily's shoulder. "Sarah would have loved to help James. She always said that deaf children were just waiting for the world to learn their language." James had fully awakened by now and was looking around with the bright-eyed alertness of a well-rested baby. When he spotted Lily, he gurgled and reached out his hands toward her. "He wants to say hi," Lily announced, and before anyone could stop her, she was signing to James with the fluid grace of a native speaker. "Hi, baby James. I'm Lily. Your mama loves you very much." James responded with delighted laughter, clapping his hands and babbling in the way that babies do when they're genuinely happy. Victoria watched the interaction with tears in her eyes, seeing her son communicate with more joy and ease than she'd witnessed in months. "Your daughter is amazing," she whispered to Daniel. "She gets that from her mother," Daniel replied, watching Lily teach James to wave goodbye. "Sarah always said that children learn sign language faster than adults because they haven't been taught that communication has to be hard." As passengers began to disembark, Victoria gathered her things with obvious reluctance. The spell of the last few hours was breaking, and she seemed afraid that once they left the plane, the connection would be zero. "Daniel," she said urgently, "I meant what I said about staying in touch. I want to learn everything you can teach me about helping James, and I want to." She paused, seeming to struggle with something. "I want to pay you. For your time, for your expertise. This is worth more than I can express." Daniel shook his head immediately. "I can't accept money for this. What I shared with you today, it's what Sarah would have wanted. She believed information about deaf culture should be freely shared, not sold." "But surely there's something," Victoria insisted, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of receiving such a gift without giving something in return. Lily tugged on Daniel's shirt and whispered something in his ear. Daniel listened, nodded, and then smiled at Victoria with the first truly relaxed expression she'd seen from him. "Actually, there is something," he said. "Lily wants to know if James would like to be her friend. She doesn't have many friends who know sign language, and she thinks he's going to be really good at it." Victoria looked down at her son, who was still watching Lily with obvious fascination, then back at Daniel. "I think James would love that very much." And so it was that two families, one wealthy, one modest, one headed by a CEO, and one by a software engineer, began an unlikely friendship 37,000 feet above the ground, brought together by a crying baby and the universal language of love. As they walked off the plane together, Daniel carrying Lily's backpack and Victoria holding a much more peaceful James, neither of them could have predicted how this chance encounter would change their lives. Victoria would go on to learn fluent sign language, becoming an advocate for deaf and hard-of-hearing children through her company's charitable foundation. James would grow up bilingual in ways that made him a bridge between two worlds, comfortable in both hearing and deaf communities. Daniel would find, for the first time since Sarah's death, that helping someone else navigate the world his wife had shown him was a way of keeping her memory alive that felt like healing rather than grief. And Lily would gain not just a friend in James, but a second family that understood the beauty of communication beyond words. But all of that was still in the future. For now, as they made their way through the bustling terminal at Eleg, Daniel couldn't help but think that Sarah would have loved this moment. The moment when understanding bridged the gap between worlds, when kindness triumphed over judgment, and when a crying baby became the catalyst for something beautiful. "Daddy," Lily said as they reached the baggage claim area, "I think Mommy would be proud of you." Daniel squeezed his daughter's hand and looked over at Victoria, who was signing airport to James with growing confidence. "I think you're right, little bird. I think she would be proud of all of us." And somewhere in the busy terminal, surrounded by the ordinary chaos of travelers and tourists, two families discovered that sometimes the most extraordinary connections come from the simplest act of reaching out to help someone who needs what you have to give. In this case, what Daniel had to give wasn't money or status or power. It was understanding, patience, and the knowledge that love speaks every language, especially the ones that can't be heard. The story could have ended there, with a heart-warming encounter and new friendships formed. But the real transformation was just beginning. As Victoria and Daniel exchanged one final round of contact information and prepared to part ways, James began to fuss again. Not with the desperate crying of before, but with the ordinary complaints of a baby who was tired and overstimulated. Without thinking, Victoria raised her hands and signed, "Sleepy time," one of the phrases Daniel had taught her during the flight. James immediately calmed, recognizing the familiar gesture and understanding that his mother was acknowledging his needs. "I can't believe how different this feels," Victoria said, wonder in her voice. "For the first time since he was born, I feel like I actually know how to be his mother." Daniel smiled, remembering his own early days of learning to communicate with Sarah, the relief and joy of finally finding a way to connect that worked for both of them. "You've always known how to be his mother. Now you just have the tools to show him." As they finally went their separate ways, Victoria to a waiting car service, Daniel and Lily to the rental car counter, both parents carried with them more than just the memory of an unusual flight. They carried the knowledge that differences could be bridges rather than barriers, that help could come from the most unexpected sources, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is simply the recognition that they're not alone in their struggle. The plane ride from New York to Los Angeles had lasted 5 hours and 23 minutes, but the friendship that began in the sky above America would last much longer, grounded in the understanding that when we take the time to learn each other's languages, whether spoken, signed, or simply felt, we discover that we're all much more alike than different. And James? He slept peacefully all the way home, safe in the knowledge that his mother could finally hear what he'd been trying to say all along. That love in any language is always worth the effort it takes to understand. 3 weeks later, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text message that made him smile. It was a video from Victoria, showing James sitting in his high chair, signing "more," with perfect clarity as he pointed to his breakfast. The caption read, "His first real sign. Thank you for giving us this gift." Daniel showed the video to Lily, who clapped her hands in delight. "James is getting so good. Can we visit him soon?" The visits had become a regular thing. Every Saturday, Daniel and Lily would drive to Victoria's house in Beverly Hills, a journey that should have felt intimidating, but somehow didn't. Victoria had made sure of that, greeting them at the door in jeans and a simple sweater, James in her arms, babbling excitedly when he saw his new friends arrive. The house itself was a study in contrasts. Expensive art hung on the walls next to colorful pictures that James had painted with finger paints. Designer furniture shared space with baby toys and the growing collection of sign language books that Victoria had ordered. It was the home of someone learning to balance two worlds, the high-powered business executive and the devoted mother discovering her child's unique needs. I never realized how much I was missing," Victoria had confided to Daniel during one of their visits, watching Lily teach James the sign for airplane while they played with toy jets on the living room floor. "All those months, I thought successful parenting meant having the perfect schedule, the best nanny, the most expensive everything. But what James needed was just understanding." Daniel had nodded, remembering his own early assumptions about parenthood. Before Sarah's death, he'd thought being a good father meant providing financially, being present for the big moments, teaching Lily to ride a bike and helping with homework. It wasn't until he became a single parent that he realized how much of parenting was simply paying attention, really paying attention to who your child was becoming and what they needed to thrive. "You're learning fast," he'd assured Victoria, watching her sign "good job" to James when he successfully stacked 3 blocks. Sarah always said that hearing parents of deaf children often become more fluent faster than hearing people learning sign language for other reasons. There's a motivation there that's hard to match. "I dream in sign language now," Victoria had admitted with a laugh. "Last night I dreamed I was giving a board presentation entirely in ASL. I woke up wondering if my subconscious was trying to tell me something." It was during one of these Saturday visits that Victoria brought up the idea that would change everything. "Daniel, I've been thinking, she said as they watched the children play. James had just turned 9 months old and was pulling himself up to standing, chattering in the mixed language of baby sounds and emerging signs that delighted everyone who witnessed it. My company has a charitable foundation. We focus mainly on educational initiatives, but I've been wondering if we could do something more targeted, something for deaf and hard of hearing children and their families. Daniel looked at her with interest. What did you have in mind? I don't know exactly. That's why I'm asking you. Victoria's expression grew serious, the same focused intensity she probably brought to boardroom meetings, now directed at something much more personal. I keep thinking about that day on the plane, about how lost I felt, how much I didn't know. There have to be thousands of parents out there going through the same thing, parents who don't happen to meet someone like you on an airplane. Lily looked up from where she was showing James how to sign cat while pointing to a picture book. Daddy, that's a really good idea. Remember how scared I was when Mommy first taught me signs? I thought I was doing everything wrong. Daniel smiled at his daughter, once again amazed by her insight. Lily had been barely 2 when Sarah began teaching her sign language, and while she'd taken to it naturally, he remembered her frustration during those early weeks when her small fingers couldn't quite form the shapes she wanted them to make. There are resources, Daniel said slowly, his mind already working through the possibilities. Support groups, early intervention programs, educational materials, but a lot of them are underfunded or hard to find, and many hearing parents don't even know where to start looking. Exactly, Victoria said, leaning forward with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found a problem she could actually solve. What if we could create something comprehensive? Not just funding, but education, support, maybe even some kind of mentorship program where families who've been through this could help families just starting the journey. Daniel felt something stir in his chest, a familiar sensation he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. It was the feeling of purpose, of seeing a way to turn personal experience into something that could help others. Sarah had always dreamed of doing something like this, creating bridges between the hearing and deaf communities, helping families navigate the early challenges of raising deaf children. She would have loved this, he said quietly, and Victoria didn't need to ask who he meant. I hope so, Victoria replied softly, because I'd like to name it after her, if you're okay with that. The Sarah Carter Foundation for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Children and Families. Daniel felt his eyes begin to water, and he looked away quickly, not wanting to break down in front of the children. But Lily had noticed, as she always did. Daddy, are you sad crying or happy crying? She asked, abandoning her picture book to come sit beside him on the couch. Happy crying, little bird, Daniel managed, wrapping his arm around his daughter. Very happy crying. James, not wanting to be left out of whatever was happening, crawled over and pulled himself up using Daniel's leg, babbling and reaching his arms up to be held. Without thinking, Daniel scooped him up, and James immediately began signing happy, one of his newest and favorite words. I think he approves, Victoria said, her own voice slightly thick with emotion. Over the following months, the Sarah Carter Foundation became more than just an idea. Victoria threw herself into the project with the same intensity she'd once reserved for quarterly profit reports and market expansion strategies. She hired specialists, consulted with deaf community leaders, and worked with Daniel to develop programs that would actually meet the needs of families struggling with the same challenges they'd both faced. The Foundation's first initiative was a series of workshops for parents of newly diagnosed deaf and hard of hearing children. Daniel found himself in the unexpected role of program developer and occasional instructor, sharing his knowledge of sign language and deaf culture with parents who looked exactly as lost and overwhelmed as Victoria had on that airplane months ago. Remember, he would tell each new group, your child isn't broken or missing something. They're just communicating in a different language. Your job isn't to fix them, It's to learn their language so you can join their conversation. The workshops were small at first, held in community centers and library meeting rooms. But word spread quickly through the network of parents, doctors, and early intervention specialists. Within 6 months, there was a waiting list. Victoria documented everything, turning her business acumen toward measuring outcomes and expanding reach. She created partnerships with hospitals and pediatric practices, ensuring that parents received information about the Foundation's resources as soon as their child was diagnosed with hearing loss. But perhaps the most successful program was the one that had emerged organically from Daniel and Victoria's own friendship. A mentorship network that paired experienced families with newly navigating ones. It's not about having all the answers, Daniel explained to a new group of mentors during their training session. It's about being someone who understands what they're going through. Sometimes the most helpful thing you can say is, "I know exactly how you feel," and it gets easier. Lily, now 5, and even more fluent in sign language, had become an unofficial junior ambassador for the Foundation. She would often accompany Daniel to workshops, demonstrating signs with the unconscious grace of a native speaker and showing other children that communication could be fun, creative, and beautiful. James, meanwhile, continued to thrive. At 15 months, he was walking steadily and had a vocabulary of over 50 signs. His hearing aids helped him catch some sounds, but sign language remained his primary mode of communication, and he was flourishing in it. Sometimes I watch him signing with other deaf children at the Foundation events. Victoria told Daniel during one of their regular coffee meetings to discuss Foundation business. And I realize he's never going to see his deafness as a limitation. For him, it's just normal. It's just who he is. That's the goal, Daniel replied, thinking of Sarah and how she'd always insisted that her deafness was simply one aspect of who she was, no more defining than her brown eyes or her love of mystery novels. When deaf children grow up in environments where sign language is valued and deaf culture is celebrated, they don't develop that sense of being less than that so many deaf adults carry. The coffee shop they frequented had become used to their conversations, which often involved extensive signing as they discussed Foundation programs or shared stories about their children. Other patrons had initially stared, but over time, the staff and regular customers had grown accustomed to the sight of hearing and signing conversations happening simultaneously. It was during one of these coffee meetings, nearly a year after their first airplane encounter, that Victoria brought up something that had been weighing on her mind. "Daniel, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." Daniel looked up from his laptop, where he'd been reviewing applications for the Foundation's new summer camp program. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Victoria hesitated, unusually uncertain for someone who was typically so direct. "Do you ever feel like I'm appropriating something that isn't mine? The deaf community, I mean. I'm a hearing parent, and sometimes I worry that I'm overstepping, trying to be part of something I don't really belong to." It was a question Daniel had been expecting, though he was glad Victoria had brought it up herself rather than letting it fester unspoken. He'd seen this concern in many hearing parents of deaf children, the fear of being outsiders in their own children's community. "Sarah used to get that question a lot, actually," Daniel said thoughtfully. "Not about hearing parents, but about me. People would ask her if it bothered her that I could hear when she couldn't, if she felt like I was an outsider in her world." "What did she say?" "She said that love makes you a native speaker of whatever language your family needs." Daniel smiled at the memory. "She also said that the deaf community isn't exclusive. It's inclusive. It welcomes anyone who respects deaf culture and commits to learning. The fact that you're hearing doesn't disqualify you from being James's advocate or from understanding his world." Victoria looked relieved, but Daniel could see she was still processing. "Besides," he continued, "James is going to grow up in both worlds, hearing and deaf. He'll need parents who can navigate both with him. You're not appropriating anything. You're expanding yourself to meet your son's needs. That's just good parenting. As if summoned by this mention of his name, Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from her nanny, accompanied by a video of James at his weekly playgroup with other deaf and hard-of-hearing toddlers. In the video, he was signing friend to a little girl his own age, both of them giggling as they played with blocks. "Look at him," Victoria said, her voice soft with wonder. "He's so confident, so happy. A year ago I was terrified that his hearing loss meant he'd struggle to connect with other people. Now I see that he's actually going to be better at communication than most kids his age." "Bilingual children often are," Daniel agreed. "They understand from an early age that there are multiple ways to express the same idea, multiple ways to connect with people. It makes them more flexible, more empathetic." Victoria saved the video to her phone, adding it to the growing collection of James milestones that she shared regularly with Daniel and Lily. These moments had become precious to her, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were so beautifully ordinary. A deaf child playing with friends, learning, growing, becoming himself without apology or limitation. "I have something to tell you," Victoria said suddenly, setting down her coffee cup with the decisive gesture of someone who'd made an important decision. Daniel looked at her expectantly. "I'm stepping back from day-to-day operations at the company, not retiring completely, but delegating more so I can spend more time with James and focus on the foundation work." Daniel raised his eyebrows in surprise. Victoria's company was her life's work, built from the ground up over nearly a decade. For her to step back was a significant decision. "Are you sure? That's a big change." "I've never been more sure of anything," Victoria said firmly. "This past year has taught me that success isn't just about building a profitable business. It's about building a life that reflects your values. And my values have shifted." She paused, looking out the coffee shop window where early autumn leaves were beginning to fall. "James is only going to be little once. The foundation is doing work that actually matters, and for the first time in my adult life, I feel like I'm using my skills and resources for something that will outlast quarterly earnings reports." Daniel nodded, understanding completely. His own priorities had shifted dramatically since becoming a single father, and again since meeting Victoria and becoming involved in foundation work. The software projects that had once energized him now felt mundane compared to the emails he received from parents whose lives had been changed by foundation programs. "Sarah would be proud," he said simply. "I hope so," Victoria replied. "I hope she'd think we're honoring her memory in the right way." Daniel considered this, thinking about the woman who had taught him that love was a verb, not just a feeling, something you did every day through your choices and actions rather than something you simply declared. "She'd be proud," he said with certainty. "But more than that, she'd be excited. Sarah was always looking ahead, always thinking about how to make things better for the next family, the next child. She'd love seeing how this has grown into something bigger than any of us imagined." As they gathered their things to leave, Victoria to pick up James from playgroup, Daniel to collect Lily from school, Daniel reflected on how much had changed since that chaotic flight, nearly a year ago. What had started as a simple act of help had evolved into a foundation, a friendship, and a completely new direction for both their lives. The transformation hadn't always been easy. There had been moments of doubt, logistical challenges, and the occasional clash of their very different backgrounds and communication styles. But through it all, they'd been united by their commitment to their children and their shared understanding that love required action, patience, and the willingness to learn new languages, literally and figuratively. That evening, as Daniel helped Lily practice her homework and listened to her chatter about her day at school, his phone buzzed with a message from Victoria. It was another video of James, this one showing him signing Daddy while pointing to a photo on Victoria's desk. Not a photo of James's biological father, who had left during Victoria's pregnancy, but a candid shot from one of their foundation events showing Daniel and James building blocks together, while Lily offered enthusiastic commentary. The message that accompanied the video was simple. He knows who his family is. Daniel showed the video to Lily, who grinned and immediately began planning what new signs she would teach James during their next visit. "Daddy," she said as he tucked her into bed later that night, "do you think Mommy knows about James and Victoria and the foundation and everything?" It was a question Lily asked periodically, in various forms, as she continued to process her mother's death and figure out how to keep Sarah's memory alive in their evolving life. "I think," Daniel said carefully, choosing his words with the precision he'd learned was necessary when discussing big concepts with small children, "that Mommy would be really happy to see how we're using the things she taught us to help other families. I think she'd love seeing you teach James new signs, and I think she'd be proud of Victoria for working so hard to be the best mum she can be." Lily nodded solemnly, then brightened. "And I think she'd be proud of you too, Daddy, for helping that baby on the airplane, and for being a good friend to Victoria, and for making sure more families can learn sign language." Daniel kissed his daughter's forehead, marveling once again at her wisdom and her generous heart. "I love you, little bird," he said, both aloud and in sign. "I love you too, Daddy," she replied, her small hands forming the signs with perfect clarity before she snuggled down under her covers. As Daniel turned off the light and headed to his own room, he caught sight of a framed photo on the hallway table. Sarah holding newborn Lily, both of them looking directly at the camera with expressions of pure joy. It was one of his favorite pictures, taken just days after Lily's birth, when their world felt complete and full of infinite possibility. Now, looking at that photo after the day's conversations about the Foundation's growing impact and James's continued development and Lily's thoughtful questions about legacy and family, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death, a sense that their story was still being written, that loss didn't have to mean ending, and that love really could multiply when shared with others who needed it. The Foundation had helped hundreds of families in its first year of operation. Lily was thriving as a bilingual kindergartner who served as a bridge between deaf and hearing classmates during school events. James was developing into a confident, communicative toddler whose deafness was just one aspect of his vibrant personality. Victoria had discovered that using her business skills for social good was more fulfilling than any profit margin she'd ever achieved. And Daniel had learned that healing didn't require forgetting, that helping others navigate challenges you'd already faced was a way of honoring rather than moving on from the people who'd taught you how to navigate those challenges in the first place. But perhaps most importantly, two families who might never have crossed paths under ordinary circumstances had discovered that extraordinary connections could emerge from the simplest act of reaching across difference to offer help, understanding, and ultimately, love. Outside Lily's bedroom window, the Los Angeles night stretched out in all directions, full of sleeping children and dreaming parents, full of families in various stages of joy and struggle, full of infinite possibilities for connection, growth, and the kind of everyday miracles that happen when people choose compassion over judgment, understanding over assumption, and love over fear. In a house across town, James Carter Ashford, as Victoria had legally changed his name to honor the man who'd become his chosen father figure, slept peacefully under a mobile that cast gentle shadows on his walls, his tiny hands occasionally moving through dream signs that his mother now recognized and understood. The story that had begun with a crying baby on an airplane had become something much larger, a testament to the power of human connection, the beauty of communication in all its forms, and the truth that families are built not just through birth or marriage, but through the daily choice to show up for each other with patience, understanding, and unconditional love. And somewhere in the space between sleeping and waking, in the quiet hours when the world feels full of possibility, that love continued to grow, expand, and touch the lives of everyone willing to receive it.